Hey everybody, we have a special treat for you today.
Yes, we have recently launched our Growing Up in Polygamy podcast.
Yes.
You can find it on Spotify or on Google Podcasts. And every single week, we're going to be uploading the audio from our video onto our podcast, so you have an opportunity to listen to it there if it's easier than watching our YouTube video.
Yes, and this week, because of all of the amazing questions that you all had for Melissa, what it was like for her growing up LDS, we had so many great questions that this turned out to be a very long video that we're going to have to split up into multiple parts. So thank you for all those amazing questions. However, you will have a chance to listen to all of it at once on our podcast.
So go to our podcast, again, Growing Up in Polygamy, both on Spotify and on Google Podcasts. Find us, download, and you can hear the entire segment all in one shot.
Enjoy. Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Sam.
And I'm Melissa.
I grew up in the FLDS community. It is a polygamous group run by Warren Jeffs, which I moved out of when I was 18 years old.
And today we're going to mix it up just a little bit.
Yes, we are. We're going to have some fun. We're going to answer a lot of questions that you all had about Melissa and her life.
Yeah, I sent out there and asked Instagram and our community with YouTube, because I always feel like whenever anybody asks questions about how I was raised LDS, compared to Sam, I feel like my story's super boring. And so it's very sweet of so many of you to ask, and we thought, okay, let's get into it. But I have no idea where to start. So we're super grateful for everyone that asked questions.
We got a ton of questions.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions in this one video, but we will work on getting more videos and answering all of the questions you had.
Yeah, and there were some questions that were like so good. I was like, that deserves its own video. That deserves its own video. That deserves its own video. So we'll try to go through, like Sam said, we'll go through a lot of the questions on this video, but there are some, if you did not see it, there's some that we kind of picked out and we're like, okay, we maybe need to branch out a little bit and answer some of these questions about the LDS faith as well, and make their own videos. So
yes.
Yeah.
So without further ado, we're going to jump into this and answer some of your questions, but we're going to start off with asking Melissa, kind of give us a little bit of your backstory, kind of where you're from, how you were raised originally, and all that. Yeah.
Okay, so I was born in the Covenant. And so for those of you who are not familiar with that term, my parents both were married and sealed in a temple. When they got married, they actually met at BYU. And so being sealed as a child, if you're born to parents who were sealed, then like you don't have to go into the temple later to be sealed to them. You're automatically sealed to them in the eternities. And so that's considered being born in the covenant. So I was raised LDS from the moment I was born. And then when we were 3, we moved to St. George, Utah, and that is where I was raised. And it is just a small town in southern Utah, and it's super beautiful, predominantly LDS. So I did grow up around a lot of LDS members, and even the wards or congregations that would be made up of like a couple hundred people was like a couple streets in my neighborhood, because most people were LDS.
Yeah. There's a lot of church buildings, LDS church buildings in St. George.
Yeah, like you don't ever have to drive more than 2 minutes, honestly, to get to your church building. So, predominantly LDS. I'm the oldest of 4 siblings. So it goes me, and then I have 2 younger brothers, and then a baby sister. And yeah, I had a great childhood. So I'm excited to answer some more of these questions that are like more specific, I guess.
Well, great. Well, we'll get into it a little bit and answer some of your questions, and I guess that way you can talk a little bit more about details of where you were from and all that as well, based on these questions. So starting off with, let's get into it here. Were you baptized at 8? Did you do a mission? So that's kind of 2 questions.
2 questions. And there's some other questions I saw as well that had to do with being baptized at 8. So yes, I was baptized at 8 years old. And that's common in the LDS church. It's what they consider the age of accountability, when they think that you are accountable for right and wrong choices and being able to make
those decisions.
Yeah, make decisions. And so that's the age. I think someone else had asked a question having to do with whether or not I felt like I made that decision myself, or if that was something that I was pressured into. And I'd say that it's one of those things that, like, I think just as much as, like, if a family is super into sports and their 8-year-old is encouraged to go play basketball, they're going to be, like, excited to play basketball because dad played basketball with them since they're 3. Like anything else, I feel like it's no more pressure than anything else that you're consistently surrounded by that's an exciting thing, right? That's when you become an official member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I had a great experience being baptized. My dad baptized me, and then you go to church and everybody is like, all the adults are like, welcome as a member. And it's like this big deal and a big celebration. And at the time too, you are like, at least for me, if you're born into it, so a nursery at church, you're starting at like 18 months old.
Yeah.
And then from there, you're going into sunbeams at 3. You're in primary and you're learning things. So by 8 years old, I felt like, and I had a really good basic understanding and knowledge of the LDS faith and what that entailed. So at 8 years old, I'd still say that I felt pretty prepared for that. Now having kids of my own, I'm like, I don't know if 8 years old is really the age of where you would want to make that kind of like big commitment of becoming a member to a religion. That's more of how I feel now. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that it was like harmful in any way. Right. I think that for me, it was a good experience. And like I said, from outsiders, I can see where they would think it was like this pressure, but there wasn't really like any negative side to it.
And like you said, it's something that you were raised with, and you saw your family and friends around you getting baptized. So I assume you were probably really excited for it and to make that step. Yeah. Yeah, super excited, because your entire time in primary, they're building it up too. It's like this exciting decision that you get to make, and so it was like super good experience, super exciting. Yes, I was baptized. At 8 years old, right? At 8 years old. Okay, great. Oh, the second part was a mission. Yeah, did you serve a mission? Yep. I did not serve a mission. So at the time that I could have gone, girls left at age 21. The rules have changed since then, and now they leave at 19. Mm-hmm. I honestly think that if the rules had been 19 when I was 19, I probably would have. At 21, I was already into my career, and I actually bought my first house when I was 21. Yeah. And so I remember actually praying about it at 21 and being like, oh my gosh, is this something that I should do? That I should like sell my house and get rid of my career, all to go on and serve the Lord? And I just received a strong impression that that's not what I was supposed to do, and so I didn't. But it's definitely something that I would have been willing to do. Yeah. Maybe at 19. Yeah, I think if it had been 19, if I wasn't already, 3 years into my career and having a house and being like well established that way. But like I said, I did pray about it to see if I was supposed to give all of that up. And the answer was no. The answer was no. I remember thinking that was actually like my first, this may sound funny, but I felt like that was my first fight with God. Oh, interesting. And I remember being like, why would you say no to this thing? Like, it's me preaching your gospel. It would be me teaching people about you. Like, how could you tell me no to something like that? And my answer was more like in my heart of, you need to continue doing the things that you're doing in your life, and these things are important as well, and this is what you should be doing. And I remember being super confused and praying about it a lot, and like going in front of the temple, because at that point I hadn't been able to go, I hadn't had my endowments out or anything, but I remember sitting outside the temple praying about it and still just feeling strongly that I wasn't supposed to go. Interesting. Well, and back in those, not saying you're old, but back in those days. Yeah, like 10 years ago, though. Yeah, exactly. It seems like the church wasn't really encouraging women to serve missions as much as they are today. And that's one of the reasons that they changed the age. Since they changed the age, a lot more common sister missionaries are going out on missions. And so when you were at that 21 age, that was something that you probably didn't feel like you were necessarily obligated. Like, as a man, serving a mission is almost a duty. It's something that you should plan on doing. Yeah, if you're worthy, you're supposed to do it. Right. Yeah. But for the women, it wasn't quite as much. No, definitely not. There was no pressure of me having to serve a mission at all. Mm-hmm. And I never felt like if I didn't serve a mission, anyone would be disappointed in me or look at me differently. Which is some of the pressures that the guys feel a lot more, but I definitely didn't feel any of that. Depending on the family, I know there are families out there that if the boys do not serve missions, they're definitely frowned upon. You know, that decision is not welcome. You know, but some families aren't so strict about it. Just depending.
And like I said, regardless of family, I'd say at that time, 10 years ago, a girl was never really ever looked down upon for not serving a mission. So
agreed. Well, great. Okay, on to the next question then.
Does it feel weird being the interviewer?
It does. Yes, I'm like I'm trying not to butt in too much because I'm so used to answering questions. But so, what are the rules about modesty?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so modesty. I guess I'll start with the basics, but I was taught that you needed to cover your shoulders and that like no tank tops, no short shorts, no bikinis. Only one piercing in each ear. Gordon B. Hinckley was the prophet of like my youth, like especially like my younger teenage years, and he was the one who came out with. I think he was the one that came out with for the Strength of Youth pamphlets. I'm pretty sure it was under.
I believe so. I wasn't a member of the church at that time, but but that does sound correct.
Yeah. Anyway, so a lot of the grooming guidelines and things like that, you know, those were all like very taught a lot.
Right.
I feel like now I see a lot more like leniency and people aren't as strict with modesty standards. But when I was young and especially in high school, in that age, like I made sure to always cover my shoulders and I never wore short shorts. And I followed those rules like really
to the T.
Yeah, to the T. They meant like a lot to me in representing like me actually doing what I believed in. And so for me, it was an outward expression of following what Heavenly Father wanted me to follow. I'm trying to think if there's any other modesty things like that. I mean that's the main one.
You're talking to me. I was raised with
covering everything.
Cover your whole body.
Yeah, me and my T-shirt and my long board shorts would have been considered immodest to some.
So I didn't grow up with rules necessarily. I did on my mission teach some modesty rules, but it was mainly the piercings and not having extra piercings and things like that. So,
piercings. Then one piercing in each ear, but like no piercings on your nose or face or belly button or anything like that. So those are the only piercings. But yeah, I think that's most of it. And yeah, I definitely followed all of those. I don't think I think my first pair of like short shorts was me being a little bit more rebellious, like all the way in college when I was like 20 years old. So I definitely followed all the rules.
You banded a rule in college.
I banded a rule in college. Yeah, exactly.
No college age person bans rules, right?
No, just me and my short shorts.
Yep. All right, great. Moving on here. This is a similar question, but it goes right along with that one. What are expectations for women?
Oh,
It's a big question. Yeah. I know.
That's a big question. I think another question too that I had like read through as I was briefly like seeing them as we were going along was also having to do with like roles and expectations. And I'd say that the roles for women and expectations, just gender roles, a lot of that was taught from the family, A Proclamation to the World, which again came out when Gordon B. Hinckley was prophet. And that was very like well taught, like taught in Sunday school, taught in young women's. And it specifically talked about like the role of a woman to be a mother and to be in the home and be the primary caretaker and rearing children, and that husbands were to be the primary providers for the home and to be like the priesthood holders. And you know, at that point too, it was marriage between like specifically marriage between a man and a woman. These are their roles in a family, and that they are like to work together as a team. The family proclamation to the world is something that though I joined the church later on, it was something that I was given upon completion of my mission, and I remember we got it when we were married. Yeah, we got a couple of them actually as gifts for wedding gifts.
Yeah, so it's very much taught, and I believe still to this day is taught a lot throughout the church. So.
Yeah, so I'd say most of the gender roles and what was taught for me as a woman was based on that, but definitely it was emphasized too that your primary purpose is to become a mother and to stay at home to rear them. So I feel like that's probably, it's shifted a little bit more, and I feel like now the church is a lot more understanding recently of people working and having careers and just overall more supportive of lots of, like, having the family look a whole bunch of different ways. But back then, it's crazy. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, that just in 10 years. But definitely when I was a teenager, it was a lot more traditional Christian family values.
Yeah.
I guess that's the best way to put it.
The church has definitely shifted and changed a little bit over time. So.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Have you seen the Book of Mormon musical?
I have not. I have not seen it. I have heard some songs from it. Someone once was like, "Oh, have you heard this song?" and like played it or something, but I have not seen the musical.
Yeah, me neither. I've heard about it, and I imagine that a lot of people would love to hear our opinion on it.
Yeah.
But no, I have not seen it. I know that I don't know about a lot, but I know of active members of the LDS Church that have seen it, and so I know.
Yeah. We just haven't done it yet.
I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question.
On Broadway, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even sure where they. Do you know where they is it performed?
It was on Broadway.
Oh, it was on
in New York, but yeah. So nope, I haven't seen it.
Maybe we'll have to see it one of these days, and then we'll share our opinion on that.
Give our opinion on it.
Great. Let's see here. Did you have any fallen away family or friends, and ever talk to them about why they left?
So I would say in my youth, I didn't really know a lot of people who had left the church. I definitely had some friends like in high school that were more like rebellious, or some that had quote unquote like made mistakes or things that kept them from going on missions. But none of them it wasn't ever because of not believing in the church or having questions like that. It was always just like choices they had made didn't line up with church standards, if that makes sense. So there wasn't anyone. Also, as a teenager, I'd say that anytime, I normally would go to people who had strong testimonies when I had questions. And so, because I didn't want my testimony to be heard in any way. Yeah. And so I would go to my friends that were returned missionaries and things like that when I had questions, to make sure that I didn't really hear why people would have left. Obviously, the older that I got, I did end up obviously reaching out to some people. And when Sam and I were going through our journey, and there were some friends in particular that were a huge strength to me when I was in the church, like in Young Women's, and that were good friends and good examples to me of what a testimony should look like. And then when we were going through our faith journey, then I reached out because I knew that this person had left, and I hadn't talked to them in years, and they were still just as sweet and kind and loving and just helping me get some of my emotions and feelings out. And validating some of the questions that I had, and I was like, have you ever thought of this or questioned that? And is this some of the reasons that you left, or do you have different reasons? And some of those things, which was really super helpful for me to not feel so alone, because sometimes you feel so alone and luckily Sam and I have each other, which is awesome, but it was nice for me to reach out to someone that I knew had also been super strong in the church like what we were, and to kind of bounce ideas and thoughts off of her was super helpful. So thank you. You know who you are. Thank you.
And it's been great, for any of you out there that are questioning your faith or beliefs or any of that, it's very nice to have people to rely on. And I remember when we first started having questions, we knew of people, friends, or family even to some extent, that had these doubts or had fallen away from the church. And it was just like when you start having questions, you're so curious. You're like, wait, so what questions did this person have? Are they the same as my questions? Are they completely different? What are people's reasons for not wanting to continue on with what they currently believe? So anyway, for any of you out there that might want to talk to us or send us an email or something, we're definitely willing to talk with you and kind of share our experience. So. Yeah,
feel free to reach out, because like I said, it can feel lonely when you're in the middle of a faith transition, or even if you just have questions in general, and it's so hard to find answers that you feel like aren't going to be super negative and super, just negative and harsh and hurtful, I guess. Yeah. So, email us. Our email's in the description.
Yep. Love to talk to any of you about it. So, all right. Sorry, did we get all that? Did you have anything else to say on that one? Okay. Great. Okay. So this one is, we sort of touched on this, but we can expand a little bit. I think this will go back to the family proclamation to the world. But the question is, great question, what were you taught about men and women's rules and relationships?
Rules and relationships? Yeah, I mean, I think came back down to the family proclamation to the world. And for those of you who haven't read it, then you can just go online and you'll be able to find information on it there. And like I said, I would definitely just very traditional Christian values.
Yeah, it's available. I believe you can just probably Google it.
Yeah,
and pull it up and read it.
And be able to read it. Or maybe we have to do a video on that. Actually, that would be a good video,
that's
right?
A good video.
Where we can read it through it and kind of explain how it was taught to us.
Jot that down. Yeah. Idea
Put
there.
it on the list.
Perfect. Many things on the list here. Okay, great. Well, we'll move right on to the next one then. Was questioning the LDS faith something you could do openly at home or church?
Okay, that's a really good question. So, growing up, I feel like my parents are both converts to the church. And I feel like because of that, and like my dad being raised Catholic, my mom being raised Lutheran, they were always like really open to other religions and always open to talking to us about things. And they also had this aspect to my childhood where they always gave us like logical reasons for why we were supposed to be doing what we were doing. And so like we don't drink alcohol because the prophet said so. It was like, alcohol is not healthy for you, and if you drink too much of it at too young of an age, like there's possibilities for you to do things that you'll regret, and you need to wait to there was always not just because the prophet said so. And so for me, I felt like that opened up a world of like, we definitely felt way comfortable asking questions at home. And I know that my dad has even told me since, like, as being an adult, he's like, yeah, sometimes when you kids would ask questions, it was like a test of my faith, because I was like, I don't know the answer to that's a really good question, and so it was definitely open in the home. In church, that's another story, because I feel like being raised in the church, there's this fine line between you don't want to look like a doubter, but you still, when you have questions, you want to be able to ask them and get some kind of answer. And depending on the teacher, like there were definitely some seminary teachers that were way more open to the tough questions. And I felt like they had logical answers that like sufficed and were good enough for me at that time and at that age. But overall, I'd say at church, it was a little bit scary to try to ask too tough of a question. Because if you came off as you doubting, then you would be struggling, and then you would get this extra attention by your teachers and by your peers, and everyone would be asking if you were okay and if you were having doubts, and I feel like you would just get unwanted attention over questions that were too deep, I guess. So at church, you have to play a fine line. At home, I felt like I was able to ask questions pretty openly.
And you had a great family that, kind of was, from the very beginning, wanted to give you reasons. And that kind of makes sense, because you are you're the type of person that you want reasons for something. You don't want to just do something or follow blindly, as they say. You want to know the reason for it. Like, okay, tell me the reason. If it makes sense for me, then I will do it. And that makes sense, because there's other families that probably wouldn't be so open to discussing things like you did at home. Yeah,
that might I definitely know that there are some families that were definitely more because the prophet said so type of families. And I'm grateful that mine wasn't like that, just because, my mindset works where I need to have a reason, and it has to make logical sense as well. Not that it had to completely lack faith, but to me, if Heavenly Father was telling me to do something, there would need to be a reason, because he wouldn't just come up with things out of the blue for no reason, right? Like, at least that's how I felt growing up. And so to me, it was just about finding out as much as I could about what God's reasons were.
Yeah. And I think it'd be similar for the leaders of the church, depending on, I know there's probably some leaders out there that wouldn't take a question very well. They'd probably think that you were doubting, or that you had these questions for some who knows what reason. But I think it depends on which leader you went to, because you and I, when we started having questions and concerns, we went to several leaders, and I feel like the leaders we went to handled it really well. Just very encouraging and tried to answer the questions the best they could. But some leaders might not do that.
We looked out when when we were going through our faith transition and talking to leaders. And I feel like they were very helpful and very understanding. And, you know, unfortunately, they weren't able to really have the answers to our questions. But we felt still like loved and accepted by them while that was happening. So we're very lucky.
And we didn't go into it trying to cast blame on anyone either, you know. So we were sincerely trying to figure out, you know, and understand. But anyway, so I think it depends a lot on the family and that. But luckily, Melissa had a family that was very understanding. So. All right, well, this is a perfect question leading up, or follow-up question for what we just talked about. Were your parents raised LDS? You sort of already answered that. As well, or how did your family join the church?
Yeah, so both my parents are converts, and my mom has a really cool conversion story. So her mom had been taking the missionary discussions, and every time that the missionaries would come over, they'd be like, oh, come on over, you know, come talk with us. And she was like, no, I've got my own religion, leave me alone. And just would kind of always brush aside the missionaries. And one day she was on her balcony and she just said, God, if you are there, I need to know, and I need to know now. And knock, knock, knock on the door were the missionaries. And she opened up the door and she saw that it was them, and she's like, I need to be baptized. And they were like, we should probably teach you some lessons first. Like, what? Like, so surprised. And yeah, and then it wasn't too much longer after that. I can't remember the exact timeline, but she ended up packing up all her stuff, moving across the country to go to BYU, and that's where she met my dad. But yeah, so super cool conversion story on her side. And for my dad, his dad had remarried and had married a lady who was inactive, but once there were kids in her home, she decided that she wanted, you know, to start taking them to church. And my grandpa said, hey, to make her feel more like your mom, you need to be baptized in her church and start going to church with her. Now, my grandpa would never go to church ever. There was never going to be, that wasn't a possibility, but he made sure that the kids went with their stepmom. And then when my dad's stepmom and dad split up, they actually stayed with their stepmom, and so he continues to be raised LDS. I think he was baptized around 12, early teens, and he ended up serving a mission in Japan. So yeah, and then met my mom at BYU housing. So
very interesting,
yeah, interesting conversion stories. They're both like different stories. It's not like Sam's got like pioneer heritage like through and through, and his like family tree is crazy, and my family is just my parents.
My great-grandfather moved from Europe to Utah and joined the church. So, and then from there, but because my father is much like he's 80 in his 80s now. So my great-grandfather, that was a long time ago.
Very long time ago. But yeah, for me, my parents both converts.
Yeah,
and that's what our LDS history is all from. Just my parents.
Both converts. Awesome. When, if ever, were you taught about the history of polygamy in the church?
Ooh,
big question.
Yeah. So I'd say the majority of my church history would probably have been taught in seminary. So for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar, seminary is a high school course basically that you get to take. And in Utah, the high schools actually release you for a period out of your school day, and there's normally church buildings either right on the parking lots of the high schools or like right across the street, and you're released to go and spend a period at seminary and to go and have religion classes. And during your 4 years of high school, you go through the 4 different scriptures. So every year is a different one. It's Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, the Bible, and then I think it is Pearl of Great Price or Joseph Smith. Oh,
Joseph Smith history or Pearl. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Goodness, I might be off. But like you studied a different scripture every year. And so there was always one year that emphasized either in Doctrine and Covenants or the other year that I can't think of. But they emphasized and talked a lot about church history. And so that would definitely be when I was introduced to polygamy, was in high school.
Okay.
And they did mention a little bit in Sunday school, but I feel like it wasn't taught as deeply as what it was in seminary. And seminary also, I feel like a lot of those instructors are way more open to the harder questions or to digging a little bit deeper. And so at that time, I felt like they were addressing hard questions, where now there's definitely things that I was not taught about polygamy or the way that it was practiced at that time that, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I went through all these seminary lessons. I went through my whole life, and then there's still these huge, or things that feel really huge, details about Joseph Smith and polygamy that I did not know. But I feel like they did pretty well in giving us a basic history and giving us good enough answers at the time to be able to understand why polygamy had been restored through Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
I felt like I got good enough answers to feel comfortable with it.
They had some answers at least.
Yeah, polygamy was always one of those things, honestly, that was a hard topic for me personally, which is hilarious to me that I ended up marrying somebody who was from a polygamous group, because how much polygamy always bothered me.
Yeah. Keyword being from a polygamous group.
From.
No interest
not a
anymore.
Part. But, yeah, I'd say, I had a lot of exposure to it. And it was something that, always kind of troubled me.
Interesting.
But in high school, they gave answers that were good enough.
And in high school, there were probably things you didn't really think twice about that now you think more about because you're married and you have children of your own. And,
absolutely.
And so your view on life is probably a lot different now than it was back then when you were originally learning about polygamy.
Well, yeah, because when you're a teenager and you're like 16, 17 and you feel like you know everything and you're an adult and you find out that there are marriages of 16, 17-year-old girls. You're like, well, I could be married because I'm like a grown-up. And then you get married and you have kids and you're like, 16's way too young to be married. Or, so there's definitely things that, the older you get and the more life experience you have, like a little tougher to swallow.
Exactly.
Within polygamy. But.
Great. Okay. Well, on to the next one then. Do you still keep in touch with your parents now that you have left the LDS?
Yes. We have a great relationship with my parents.
We do.
Yeah. We have a great relationship. They live really close to us. They babysit a lot so that we can even make YouTube videos or do whatever we're doing, go on date nights. So we have a great relationship. And, my dad had already left the LDS church before we did. And so, actually before we even got married. And so for him, obviously, it was no big deal at all. And then for my mom, it was hard emotionally, but I feel like her and I have a really good relationship and open communication. And so she was really good about, even though it was hard for her, just listening to my reasons. And I feel like it comes down to just good communication with those family members that you want to be able to have those still strong relationships with. My brothers are both still active in the church, and I think that's actually a question someone else asked too, but they're both still active, and they had come on a trip and came down and had a good long talk with me. And it's not about whether or not we believe the same. It's being willing to understand why they feel how they feel and why they choose to believe, and why I feel the way I feel, and then being willing to take the time to understand my emotions and understand why I chose to leave. And I feel like once we had that talk, all of our relationships have been great. And I'm just grateful that my family is the type of family that was willing to have those tough conversations so that we could continue being understanding.
Her family can be a little bit uncomfortable in the beginning because they have to talk it out. They're not a family that they'll just let something slide under their rug or whatever.
We don't hold back.
They don't hold back. They have to talk it out, which is it can be a little bit uncomfortable at first, but in the end, I feel like it's really good because they force each other to open up and share their feelings, and now I feel like you have a great relationship with all of your family, regardless of different beliefs in that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was Sam getting married from a family where he was raised in a family where you don't talk about any emotions or feelings at all, and there's no way that he could ever disagree with his parents. Whatever his father said was the law, and his mother enforced it, and also had a set of laws, and then the church had a set of laws, and none of them were non-negotiable, right? And so to come into my family where my mom says something and I'm like, oh, I don't agree with that.
I'm like, oh, we're talking about this?
We're talking about this?
Okay.
Or she made you feel uncomfortable and you're going to talk to her about it. And so, it's definitely a little bit of a learning curve, but
it's been good though. It's good to have kind of all the different experiences and now we can kind of choose the the best we can and live life that way. So, but open communication, I think, is key, especially when it comes to beliefs. So many people get into fights and disagreements over religion, and I really do think that if people would take the time to sit and try to openly communicate, and not only communicate but understand each other, I just think it'd be so much easier for everyone, because some people just can't understand why someone would possibly leave what they believe behind, and other people can't believe why you would keep believing this if it's obviously so. Anyway, so it's definitely important to just communicate and try to understand each other.
Yeah, and I'd say, going along with this before we move on to another question, you know, we've had other conversations with with friends or family that are still LDS that were a lot tougher conversations to have and didn't go as well. And I'd say, you know, along with what Sam was saying, if we're talking to each other, truly trying to understand instead of trying to convince.
Right.
It's when we have conversations where we're trying to convince, and it shouldn't be either way. Like, I never want to convince somebody why I don't believe in the church, right? I don't want to give those reasons. I don't want to convince someone. And same way, when we've had conversations that haven't gone as well, it's normally because when we're trying to explain how we feel or why we feel the way that we do, and instead of trying to understand, people are trying to preach or tell us, you know, oh, well, but this says this or this says that, or, you know, those type of things. So going into conversations, being willing to say, this conversation isn't about convincing you that it's right or it's wrong or any of that, and like let go of the ego on both sides and say, my goal is to just understand why you feel the way you feel. And I feel like that's the moment when you can actually still have those good conversations and have them be productive at all.
Yep.
So
I always say you can never win an argument over religion.
Yeah, because they shouldn't be to win.
And because it comes down to people's personal experiences and personal beliefs and personal feelings. And so one person could feel completely different about it than another person. And if you're just going to sit there and argue about it, there's no winning. It just turns into an argument and a fight. So
so thanks for coming to our TED Talk.
Yes.
And we will continue.
Moving on.
We feel strongly about that, but we'll continue on.
Alrighty. Were any foods or holidays not allowed for kids in the LDS religion?
No, it is not like the FLDS in that sense. So all the holidays, I mean, even I know some Christian religions won't let people celebrate Halloween. There were church Halloween events where kids would get dressed up. So every single holiday is celebrated. In my family specifically, anytime that there's an excuse to have a lot of food and family and friends around, we will celebrate it. So definitely at all the holidays. Food, the only things that were restricted were things that were in the Word of Wisdom, which is the church's health code. And that includes, no smoking or tobacco, no alcohol, and then no coffee or tea. And so those are the main things of the Word of Wisdom. So none of those were allowed ever. But beyond that, that was really all when it came to health, I would say, or to foods.
Yeah, I remember when I first moved away from the FLDS with all the rules and strictness of no eating these foods and no celebrating, no having fun, and moving in with this family that took me in after I moved out, and just the excitement around holidays and things, and I remember one thing that was told to me was that this family told me was, if we have an opportunity to celebrate Christ, we're going to take it. Specifically talking about Christmas, right? And because when I was trying to understand where I came from, we weren't allowed to celebrate, and then in the LDS church, it's so similar. We are. All right, awesome. On to the next question here. Great question from someone. They say, "I am LDS right now. I would like to know what you didn't like or didn't make sense to you in the church."
Okay, so that is a really good question. And I would say that my reasons really didn't have anything to do with not liking certain aspects of the church as an organization. So I think, just to make that distinction real quick, because a lot of times I would always hear when I was in the church that, so-and-so left because they had their feelings hurt, or they didn't like the way one bishop did something, or they didn't like one aspect of young women's, or things like that. And it didn't have to do with anything I didn't like within the organization. It all had to do with doctrine that I no longer believed. So just to make that distinction to start with. And then we'll do a video. We really need to do a video that's more about some of the details of some of the things that were hard for us, because we kind of had different reasons. But I'll just give you kind of my main two that were the hardest for me. One was the polygamy, actually. And it was more of, I'd been taught a lot about it. And like I said before, in seminary, and I'd read a lot of church history, and I'd had it be troublesome to me before Sam and I ever met. And I just kind of like ended up putting it on a shelf and being like, this seems like sketchy. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm going to put it over here. I don't want to think about it anymore, because I felt like no one could give me answers. And then when Sam and I started having our journey and kind of took it back off the shelf and reevaluated it, there were just certain details to it that I'd either not been taught at all, and things that were bothersome, having to do with like the timeline of when Joseph Smith received revelation about polygamy, the way that it was practiced when it first happened, and some of the secrecy and some of the ways that things were handled in the early practices of the church. That the more that I dug into it, and when I say dug, I only looked at LDS sources and went to LDS.org for my answers. So I went and read like all the essays on polygamy, on Joseph Smith having wives, and them saying in their essays that he married a 14-year-old girl, and in their own essays, so when I say I dug deep, like I dug super deep into the church sources and trying to find answers that way. And that is where I found my answers, and that's where they were hard for me, and it was super hard on my heart. The other main thing that was tougher for me is seeing the changes that were happening within the church, that I felt like growing up I was taught that the prophets' teachings would always build upon each other. Like we learned a lot about past prophets' teachings, and once we were married, I was starting to see changes within the church that I personally felt like were trying to kind of more please the masses, and instead of building on past prophets, we're kind of tearing down past prophets and things that they had said, or just seeing those changes. And I just really, it was hard for me to come to terms with, if I had been in the church 50 years ago and this is the way to return back to my Heavenly Father, I would have been taught such different doctrine and teachings compared to how I'm told now to be able to get back to my Heavenly Father. And just because those changes weren't okay for me, it doesn't mean that they can't feel okay to other people. And I totally acknowledge that. Like there are certain things where it just is up to every person. There's going to be things that like bother, and even between Sam and me, there's things that bother me in church history that don't bother Sam at all. And it's just not as big of a deal to him. And there's things that bother him that just aren't as big of a deal to me. So everybody has a certain things that will weigh heavier on their hearts. And like I said, this is kind of the quick version of two that were heavier on my heart. But there's definitely room for, if people feel comfortable with the modern revelation that is making those changes and feel like that is directed from God and that's how it's supposed to be, I totally understand that as well. But for me, it didn't feel right. And so those were two of my main things, I guess. No,
it's kind of a heavier question.
I hope that.
And it's definitely something that requires its own video where we can kind of get into this, because, Melissa and I, when we started looking into our questions and that, it was just one of those things where we started becoming more open and communicating more about it, and we started taking some of those things off of the shelf that we had just kind of put up there, and a lot of the things we are on the same, that bother us together, and other things, are completely different. So we'll have to make a video that's kind of discussing that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, and I know that we've kind of, I don't want to say skirted around, but we've kind of gotten these questions a lot. And part of the reason why we've kind of put it off is because we just want to make sure that we can handle them in the most respectful way possible, because we never want to be the reason that somebody else questions their faith, or be the reason that, or have somebody feel like we are bashing on their faith. And that's never our intention, and we always want to stay respectful. And so just trying to come up with the best way to answer that question while making sure that nobody feels attacked or uncomfortable. And so hopefully my question or my answers here don't make you feel uncomfortable. But
yeah, we do want to answer the question. People have had the question of why did we leave? What were the problems? And like Melissa says, we will make a video. We just have to do it in the right time and when we feel that we have figured out how we want to discuss it. So, anyway, after a deep question, we're going to move on to something a little bit more lighthearted.
Okay.
Lighten things up a little bit. The question is, do you have any fun girl camp stories? Did you guys do that in St. George?
Yes, we totally did girls camp. And for those of you who don't know, so girls camp is you go literally camping for a week with all of the young women in your ward, which are ages 12 to 18. And it's super fun. There's a lot of spiritual experiences. There's a lot of just fun, silly, goofy experiences. And I personally always loved girls camp. I thought that it was a blast. I loved camping anyway. And then having the opportunities to have these really touching spiritual experiences where you're out in nature. And like, at least when I went, not that people had a lot of cell phones back then anyway, but like no one had cell phones, no one had anything like that. And it was just a really, really cool experience. And I remember like having experiences where, you're getting to go up into the mountains by yourself. There was time every day to go and read your scriptures and to think and to ponder and to pray, to write in your journal. And I feel like I had really good, strong spiritual experiences being able to be in nature and having that time to be quiet and still. And it was really good as a teenager to get away and I feel like search out those type of experiences.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's something else. I love to go out into nature and just sit in the peace and quiet sometimes and think. It's amazing how much clearer your mind can be in those moments.
Absolutely.
So anyway, great. Any specific fun story you want to tell?
I would say
I know that's what you want to hear. You want to hear a specific fun story.
So I would say some fun stories were like we had one that was like a fear factor, and so we had to like eat weird things like pickled oysters and
sounds yummy.
No, it was so gross. I lost by that much at the end, and then by the time you're done eating all this gross stuff and doing all these silly challenges, and I like lost still. I was like, oh my gosh, I did all that for nothing. But that was like really fun and really good experience. And then I'd say it was fun to have any of the girls who had their first year. We called them our baby beehives, and so everyone would be assigned your baby, and it was super fun because we'd fill up bottles full of candy for them, and you just kind of had like that person. And so I remember being a baby beehive and it being like so special, and then same with like getting to have your baby beehives. So I just feel like there was a lot of getting to really bond with like the older girls and the younger girls and everyone coming together, because normally you're separated into your age groups in Sunday school and young women. So it was just a fun opportunity to get to hang out with all the ladies.
That's awesome. That's one of the things that the church does, I think, really well, where they just try to create this community that people can be a part of and kind of be there as friends and neighbors and families. And this is a perfect segue into our next question here.
Okay.
All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
You don't have any more stories you want? Okay. All right, so this someone asks a question. Let's see here. I'm trying to figure out how to use this. They say, my wife had Mormons as neighbors. She felt they were so welcoming. Is that a common thing?
I'd say that's pretty common. I'd say that a lot of people who know anyone who's LDS, that they definitely say that they come across welcoming. I don't know. I'd say that's a pretty common thing. If you have met someone who's LDS, they typically tend to be like happy-go-lucky, and they tend to be welcoming. Yeah.
I mean, and we, even though we don't attend church meetings and things, we still have great neighbors around us that are members of the church, and we will go to some of the church activities and things and still, be a part of some of those. So, and we always feel
very
welcomed and treated very well and nice. So,
yeah.
So yes, that is I would say fairly common. I don't know. I couldn't speak for every neighborhood though. So, but yeah. Okay, next question here. Was there any sort of purity culture instilled? Like girls are like flower petals, etc.?
Yes. Yes, there was.